The following story is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.
They say that on Wall Street, loyalty is just a line item on a spreadsheet, something you depreciate until it has zero value. I used to think that was just something cynical people said because they couldn't cut it in the big leagues. I genuinely believed that if you found the right people, the right team, you could build something that wasn't just about the bottom line. I know. It sounds naive now, but you have to understand who Julian was, or at least who I thought he was. 3 months ago, I was a junior partner at Meridian Capital, managing a portfolio worth just under $400 million. I had the corner office with the view of the Chrysler Building, the bonus structure that could pay off my parents' mortgage in a single year, and the absolute trust of the man who built the firm, Julian. Julian wasn't just my boss. He was the guy who plucked me out of a back-office compliance job 10 years ago because he saw something in the way I audited a botched trade. He told me that most people look at the numbers to see how much money they made, but I looked at the numbers to see where the bodies were buried. He took me under his wing, taught me how to dress, how to talk to investors, and how to spot a bluff from a CEO across a mahogany table. He was the father figure I never really had, always telling me that Meridian was going to be ours one day. He'd say we were building a legacy, not just a hedge fund. So when we started working on the Apex deal, I didn't question anything. This was supposed to be Julian's masterpiece. We were leveraging almost 40% of the firm's liquidity to acquire a distressed commercial real estate portfolio in Midtown. The plan was solid. We buy the debt, restructure the leases, and flip the buildings for a massive profit within 18 months. It was aggressive, sure, but Julian was the king of aggressive plays. I remember it was a Tuesday night, probably around 11 p.m. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew and the hum of the server room. I was running the final risk assessment models for the acquisition, just double-checking everything because the final sign-off was scheduled for Friday. I'm obsessive like that. Julian always joked that I was the only person he knew who read the footnotes in a 100-page prospectus for fun. I was scrolling through the transaction logs for our internal liquidity pool, basically the cash reserves we were going to use for the down payment. Everything looked green. The capital was there sitting in the prime brokerage accounts ready to move. But then I saw it. It was a tiny blip in the trade volume from 3 days prior, a series of small rapid-fire transfers moving out of our secondary holding account. We're talking amounts that would be rounding errors for a firm our size, 50,000 here, 80,000 there. But the destination codes were weird. Usually, when we move cash, it goes to cleared counterparties, big banks like Goldman or J.P. Morgan. These transfers were going to a routing number I didn't recognize, tagged with a generic label that just said Consulting Retainer. I almost ignored it. Honestly, in a deal this size, legal fees and consultant costs pile up fast. But something about the timing bothered me. The transfers happened at 4:02 a.m. on a Sunday. Who pays a consultant at 4 a.m. on a Sunday? So I pulled up the transaction history for that specific routing number. I expected to see maybe a few $100,000 in total payments over the last month. Instead, my screen filled up with rows of data. It wasn't just a few payments. It was a constant bleed. Over the last 6 months, nearly $5 million had been siphoned out of our operational accounts and into this mystery bucket. But here is where it got terrifying. The money wasn't just sitting there. It was being used as collateral. I dug a little deeper, bypassing the user interface and looking at the raw trade data. Whoever controlled that account wasn't spending the money. They were using it to buy put options. For those of you who don't speak finance, buying a put option is a bet that a stock or an asset is going to crash. It's how you make money when things go wrong. I felt a cold sweat prickling on the back of my neck. I started tracing the positions. The put options weren't on some random tech stock or oil futures. They were on our own liquidity providers and, even worse, on the specific real estate index that the Apex deal relied on. Someone was using our own money to bet that our massive real estate deal was going to fail. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing numbers. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was panic. I thought we had been hacked. I thought some external bad actor had gotten into our systems and was using our capital to hedge against us. It had to be a cyber attack. I immediately grabbed my phone to call our CTO, but then I stopped. If this was a hack, the intruder might be monitoring comms. I needed to be sure. I needed to know whose authorization code was used to approve those transfers. I went into the admin logs. This requires top-level clearance, which I had, thanks to Julian. I filtered for the Sunday morning transfers and found the authorization tag. It wasn't a hacker. The user ID was ADM001. That was Julian's admin code. I froze. My brain just couldn't process it. Why would Julian, the man who built this firm, the man who had his entire reputation riding on the Apex deal, be secretly betting millions of dollars that the market would crash the moment we signed the papers? It didn't make sense. It was like a pilot betting his own plane would crash while he was flying it. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a hedge he forgot to tell me about. Julian was known for complex, counterintuitive strategies. Maybe this was some kind of tax maneuver, or a way to balance our risk exposure that I just wasn't seeing. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. I closed my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I decided I wouldn't call the CTO. I would go straight to the source. I would ask Julian first thing in the morning. I told myself he would laugh, explain the strategy, and probably call me paranoid. I didn't know it then, but walking away from that computer without downloading the logs was the first mistake I made. And by the time I walked into Julian's glass-walled office the next morning, the trap had already been set. There's a specific kind of smile people give you when they're lying to your face. It's not nervous or twitchy like you see in movies. It's warm. It's patient. It's the kind of smile a parent gives a toddler who's scared of a monster under the bed. That's the smile Julian gave me when I walked into his office that morning. He was standing by the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, holding an espresso cup that probably cost more than my first car. I walked in, clutching my printed spreadsheets like a shield, my stomach doing backflips. I just blurted it out. I told him about the transfers, the consulting retainer, the put options, everything. I didn't accuse him. I just laid the data on his desk and asked him to help me understand what I was looking at. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the papers at first. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, turned to me, and asked if I'd been sleeping enough. He said I looked pale. I told him I was fine, but I needed to know why ADM01 was shorting our own liquidity pool. That's when he laughed. A genuine, hearty laugh. He walked over, put a hand on my shoulder, and told me that this was why he hired me. He said my attention to detail was unmatched, but sometimes I missed the forest for the trees. He explained that the consulting retainer was a legacy vehicle set up years ago for off-book hedging. He claimed the put options weren't betting against us. They were an insurance policy against interest rate volatility. He threw a bunch of high-level quant terms at me. Delta-neutral strategies, variance swaps, things that sound incredibly smart and incredibly boring. He said he kept it quiet so the junior traders wouldn't panic and think the firm was bearish on its own deal. Then he looked me in the eye and asked if I really thought he would jeopardize the firm he spent 20 years building. He asked me if I trusted him. And I folded. Of course I did. I wanted to trust him. I felt like an idiot for even bringing it up. I apologized, gathered up my papers, and walked out of his office feeling about 2 inches tall. I went back to my desk, shredded the spreadsheets, and tried to focus on the merger documents. But the seed was planted. And once you lose trust, you can't just glue it back together. About 3 hours later, Elena stopped by my cubicle. Elena was one of our new quantitative analysts. She was 24, brilliant, and terrifyingly efficient. She didn't play office politics. She just crunched data. She looked nervous, which was weird for her. She asked if we could grab a coffee outside the building. not the break room. Outside. We went to a little cart on 44th Street. The noise of the city was deafening, but Elena lowered her voice anyway. She told me she had been reconciling the weekly trade blotter and found something mathematically impossible. She pulled up a tablet and showed me a graph. It tracked the value of our firm's bonds against the trade volume of those mystery put options I had found. I told her I already knew about it, that Julian explained it was just an interest rate hedge. Elena looked at me like I had just said the earth was flat. She told me that was impossible. She explained that an interest rate hedge would correlate with the Fed rates or Treasury yields. These trades didn't do that. These trades correlated perfectly with our internal project milestones. She pointed to a spike on the graph. She said that every single time our firm hit a snag in the Apex deal, a permit delay, a funding hiccup, a legal issue, the short position increased in value before the news became public. My blood ran cold. She said the algorithm controlling those trades wasn't reacting to the market. It was reacting to us. It was reacting to information that only the senior partners knew. I looked at the data again. Julian had told me it was insurance. But insurance pays out when an accident happens. This looked like someone was causing the accidents to collect the payout. I asked Elena to send me everything she had to my personal email, not the work server. I told her to go home early and not to speak to anyone else about this. She looked terrified, but she nodded and left. I went back up to the office, but I didn't go to my desk. I went to the records room. If Julian was betting against us using insider info, that was illegal, sure, but it didn't explain the why. Why tank your own deal? He stood to make $50 million if the Apex deal closed. The short positions would only net him maybe $10 or $15 million. The math didn't work. Greed is usually logical, and this wasn't logical, unless I was missing the second half of the trade. I started digging into the entity that was holding the short positions. The consulting retainer account wired its profits to a shell company in the Caymans called Phoenix Holdings. Standard stuff for hiding money. But I needed to know who owned Phoenix. I spent the next 4 hours doing things that would definitely get me fired. I cross-referenced the Cayman registry with Julian's old divorce filings, looking for any link. Nothing. Then I checked the IP addresses used to access the Phoenix Holdings account portal. Most of them were routed through VPNs, but one wasn't. One login happened 3 weeks ago from a static IP address. I ran a trace on the IP. It wasn't Julian's house. It wasn't the office. It was a boutique law firm in Delaware specializing in bankruptcy restructuring and asset liquidation. I called a buddy of mine who works in distressed debt and asked him about Phoenix Holdings. He did a quick search on his Bloomberg terminal and told me that Phoenix wasn't just a shell company. It was a vulture fund. He told me they had recently filed a letter of intent to acquire distressed assets in Midtown Manhattan. The pieces slammed together in my head like a car crash. Julian wasn't trying to make a quick buck on the shorts. That was just pocket change. His real plan was the Apex deal itself. He was intentionally sabotaging the firm to drive us into insolvency. If the deal failed, our liquidity would dry up. We'd default on our loans. The bank would seize the real estate assets. And then Phoenix Holdings, Julian's secret side hustle, would swoop in and buy the entire portfolio from the bank for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just shorting the stock, he was shorting us. He was going to bankrupt the company, wipe out the equity of every employee, including me, destroy our reputations, and then walk away with the assets free and clear under a new name. I sat there in the dim light of the records room, feeling like I was going to throw up. I remembered what he said to me that morning. "Do you trust me?" I looked at my phone. I had a text from Julian. Meeting in the boardroom in 10 minutes. Bring the Apex files. We need to discuss a restructuring of the team. He knew. Somehow, he knew I was digging. And I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that the restructuring wasn't going to be about the team. It was going to be about me. Walking into that boardroom felt like walking into a funeral where you're the one in the casket. I expected to see Julian alone, maybe with his lawyer. I was ready to have a shouting match to lay out the evidence about Phoenix Holdings and force him to cut me in or back down. I was still thinking like a businessman. I should have been thinking like a criminal. The room was full. It wasn't just Julian. It was the other two senior partners, the head of legal and the VP of human resources. And in the corner, looking uncomfortable in cheap suits, were two guys I recognized immediately. Forensic accountants. Julian was sitting at the head of the table. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. He looked like a man who had just been forced to put down his favorite dog. Before I could even open my mouth to talk about the shell companies, the head of legal slid a thick binder across the mahogany table toward me. He told me to sit down. He said that in light of the irregularities discovered in the Apex deal's liquidity staging, they had conducted an emergency audit of my user activity. I felt the room spin. I tried to speak, to tell them that I was the one who found the irregularities, that I had gone to Julian about them just that morning. But Julian cut me off. He spoke softly, his voice trembling with fake emotion. He said he wanted to believe me. He said he tried to defend me when the compliance algorithm flagged my account. But the logs, he said, were undeniable. He opened the binder. It was full of trade authorizations, dozens of them, all executing the unauthorized transfers to the consulting retainer account, all buying the put options against our own firm. And at the bottom of every single page, stamped in digital ink, was my user ID. I stared at the pages. The timestamps matched the moments I was logged in working. Late. The IP addresses matched my workstation. It was a masterpiece of forgery. Or rather, it wasn't forgery. Julian had admin access. He hadn't just used his own ADM01 login like I thought. He had been ghosting my session. He had been executing these trades through my terminal, probably while I was in the bathroom or grabbing lunch, or remotely while I was asleep, masking it as my traffic. I looked up at him and asked him how he could do this. I asked him if 20 years of loyalty meant nothing. Julian just shook his head and looked at the other partners. He told them, "See? He's still denying it. I told you he's been under a lot of financial pressure lately with the new house, but I never thought he'd resort to embezzlement." It was perfect. He used the very thing I was proud of, my ambition, against me. He painted a picture of a desperate, greedy junior partner trying to hedge his bets and skimming off the top. I stood up. I started shouting about Phoenix Holdings. I told them to check the IP addresses in Delaware. I told them Julian was buying the debt. The head of legal just sighed and told me to stop making a scene. He said they had already looked into Phoenix Holdings, and, according to the documents I had allegedly prepared, it was a vendor I recommended. He had planted files on my drive. He had backdated emails. He had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was the villain. They gave me two options. Option A. I resign immediately for personal reasons, sign a terrifying NDA, and they don't press criminal charges immediately, though they reserve the right to. Option B. They call the FBI right now, have me arrested in the lobby, and I spend the next 10 years in federal prison fighting a case I couldn't afford. I looked at Julian one last time. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were dead. He was daring me to pick option B. He knew I didn't have the capital or the connections to fight Meridian. So I signed. 10 minutes later, I was standing on the sidewalk of 6th Avenue with a cardboard box containing a stapler, a photo of my parents, and a stress ball. Security had escorted me out the freight elevator. My phone had been remotely wiped by IT before I even left the building. I walked 3 blocks to a dive bar, ordered a double whiskey, and sat there trying to stop my hands from shaking. I had lost everything. My job, my reputation, my equity. And the worst part was, Julian was going to get away with it. He was going to tank the firm, buy the assets, and come out a billionaire. And I was going to be the footnote in the cautionary tale. I was about to order a second drink when I felt a vibration in my jacket pocket. It was my personal phone, the one IT couldn't wipe. I pulled it out. It was a message from a number I didn't save, but I recognized the area code. "Don't turn around. I'm at the table behind you." I froze. I slowly put the phone down and looked into the reflection of the mirror behind the bar. Elena was sitting in a booth, wearing a hoodie, looking at a tablet. I paid my tab and walked over, sliding into the booth opposite her. She looked terrified. She told me she saw security march me out. She saw the email blast about my sudden resignation. I told her it was over. I told her Julian won, that he framed me for everything. Elena shook her head. She pushed the tablet toward me. On the screen was the email she had sent to my personal account earlier that day, the one I had asked her for, the raw data. She whispered that Julian was smart, but he was old school. He thought wiping my work computer and doctoring the trade logs was enough. He didn't know she had been running a parallel archive of the raw data feed on her local drive because the main server was too slow. She had the original metadata. The trade logs Julian presented in the meeting showed my user ID executing the trades. But Elena's raw data showed the hardware MAC address of the machine that actually sent the commands. I scrolled through the lines of code. User ID, Mark L04 source, MAC E4A199. I recognized that MAC address. It wasn't my computer. It was the encrypted terminal in Julian's private office. It proved he was spoofing my login. It proved he was the one pulling the trigger. But we had a problem. This data was proprietary Meridian property. If we took this to the police, Julian would bury us in lawsuits for data theft before a detective even opened the file. And if we went to the SEC, the investigation would take years. Julian would have liquidated the company and vanished by then. I looked at Elena. I asked her why she was doing this. Why risk her career for a guy who just got fired? She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Because my dad lost his pension in '08 because of guys like Julian, and because I'm not going to let him turn me into you." That hit hard. But she was right. I told her we weren't going to the police, not yet, and we weren't going to sue him. I looked at the data. We had the proof of the fraud. We had the proof of the short positions. And, most importantly, we knew the exact timing of his next move. The Apex deal was scheduled to close in 48 hours. That was when he planned to pull the plug, trigger the default, and crash the price. I told Elena to order another round. I said we were going to write a little press release, but we weren't going to send it to the Wall Street Journal. We were going to send it to the people Julian feared the most, the people holding the other side of his bets. We were going to trigger a margin call so big it would burn Phoenix Holdings to the ground before he could even sign the deed. We didn't go to the FBI that night. We went to a 24-hour internet cafe in K-Town, paid cash for a burner laptop, and spent the next 6 hours compiling the most dangerous email ever sent from a basement in Midtown Manhattan. See, Julian's plan relied on speed. He needed the Apex deal to collapse, the stock to tank, and the payout from his put options to hit his offshore accounts before anyone asked questions. But the one thing Wall Street hates more than losing money is fraud risk. If a bank thinks a derivative contract is based on insider trading, they don't just cancel it. They freeze the collateral. We didn't just send the data to the SEC. We sent it to the risk management departments of the 3 major prime brokers holding the other side of Julian's bets. We sent them the MAC address logs, the IP traces to Phoenix Holdings, and a clear subject line: Collateral Fraud Alert, Meridian Capital. I hit send at 5:45 a.m. Then I went home, put on my best suit, and waited. The Apex deal signing ceremony was scheduled for 9 a.m. I wasn't allowed in the building, obviously. I was persona non grata. But Elena was still there. She was my eyes and ears inside the glass castle. She texted me at 8:50 a.m. Everyone is in the boardroom. Julian looks like he's about to be crowned king. Champagne is on ice. I was sitting in a coffee shop across the street, watching CNBC on the mute TV above the counter. At 9:00 a.m. exactly, the market opened. Usually when a deal this big is announced, the ticker jumps. But at 9:02 a.m. the ticker for Meridian Capital turned gray. Trading halted, pending news. My phone buzzed. It was Elena. Julian just got a call. He looks pale. Here's what was happening, though I only got the full details later from the court transcripts. The moment the prime brokers opened that email and saw the forensic proof that their counterparty was engaging in wire fraud, they issued an immediate margin call on Phoenix Holdings. They froze the consulting retainer accounts. Julian's secret war chest, the money he stole from the firm to bet against it, was suddenly locked. At 9:05 a.m., I saw 3 black SUVs pull up to the curb outside the Meridian building. They weren't town cars. They were government plates. I sipped my coffee and watched. It's funny, you spend your whole career fearing the regulators, worrying about crossing a line, but when you're watching them come for someone else, someone who truly deserves it, they look like the cavalry. Elena texted me again. FBI is in the lobby. Legal is trying to stop them. It's not working. Up in the boardroom, Julian was probably trying to spin it. He was probably telling the partners it was a misunderstanding, a technical glitch. But you can't spin a MAC address. You can't gaslight a forensic trace that places you at the scene of the crime. At 9:15 a.m., the front doors of the building opened. A phalanx of agents walked out. In the middle of them, with his hands cuffed behind his back and his jacket draped over his wrists to hide the steel, was Julian. He looked smaller. That's the only way I can describe it. The titan of industry, the man who taught me everything, looked like a scared old man who had just realized the game was over. He stopped for a second. On the sidewalk, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi already popping. He looked across the street. I don't know if he saw me through the window of the coffee shop. I like to think he did. I raised my paper cup in a little toast. The fallout was nuclear. The data we leaked didn't just prove the fraud, it exonerated me. The forensic report showed clearly that my user ID had been spoofed from Julian's terminal. The resignation I signed was voided, but there was no going back to normal. Meridian Capital was done. The reputational damage was terminal. The firm was placed into receivership, the assets were liquidated, and the employees were let go. It was a mess. A lot of good people lost their jobs because of one man's greed. Julian was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement. He's currently awaiting trial at a federal facility, and since we gave the feds the map to his offshore accounts, he can't even afford the high-end lawyers he used to brag about. He's looking at 20 years, minimum. As for me, I didn't get my job back. Honestly, I didn't want it. I walked away from Wall Street. I realized that the golden handcuffs Julian talked about weren't just about the money. They were about the complicity. They were about staying quiet when you saw a glitch because you wanted the bonus. I started a small consultancy firm last month, just me and Elena. We specialize in forensic accounting and fraud detection for institutional investors. We're the ones they hire to find the glitches. We don't have a view of the Chrysler Building, and we don't have an espresso machine that costs more than a car. But when I look at the numbers now, I know exactly what I'm looking at, and for the first time in 10 years, I sleep like a baby. So that's my story. If you ever find yourself working for a mentor who tells you that loyalty is everything, do yourself a favor. Check the logs. Because the person telling you to look at the big picture is usually the one robbing you in the details.
Thanks for watching and listening to Manhattan Exposes. What story would you like to hear next? Drop it in the comments below, and kindly leave a like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Until next time.